Welcome to TAP. Welcome to TAP. Welcome to Ting Festival. This is the first talk in the festival. It's not the first event, but it's the first talk. So we're thrilled to be able to have all these people here this afternoon and those joining us online for the talk. I'm Sandra. I'm the director here. So I'm thrilled that we're all in the space, that you've had a chance to view the exhibition, and that you've looked at the Bidlo work in particular. I'm going to hand it off to Josh Lambier. Josh is going to be our host for this session. He's going to be the interviewer, and he's going to introduce Martin. So, welcome.
Great. Thank you all. I would like to thank everybody for joining us today on site here at TAP, and of course online on Zoom, who are joining us from everywhere. I saw some people mentioning where they were from. Thank you for joining us online today. For Bidlo, Intertwining Love and Politics in World War II, a feature event in the programming of this year's TingFest, London, Ontario's Comic and Graphic Arts Festival at TAP Center for Creativity. We're very pleased to welcome today's presenter, Martin Horak, who is going to tell us about artist and editorial cartoonist František Bidlo and his fascinating connection to Martin's family history in Czechoslovakia during World War II. To begin, however, I'd like to extend a very warm note of thanks to the organizers of Ting Festival, Deanna Tamblin, who I saw earlier at some, there's Deanna, of course, and Sandra DeSalvo, who just welcomed us all, as well as Sarah Legault and Kieran Belanger, and the wonderful team here at TAP that hosts this event for inviting me. Yes, exactly, thank you. I'm really pleased to be back here at the festival. My name is Josh Lambier, and I'm the artistic director of Words, London's Literary and Creative Arts Festival. We're gathering today a few blocks away from the forks of Dashkan Zibi, or Antler River, also known as the Thames, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinookan peoples. In the London area, we're governed by various treaties. There were the Treaty 6 London Township, the Treaty 7 Sombre Township, and Treaty 21 Longwoods. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and water and as vital contributors to our community and to the London arts community writ large. Today's event will proceed in 2 acts, beginning with a presentation by our special guest, Martin, who will set the table for us this afternoon by introducing us to František Bidlo and the series of ink and watercolor drawings and letters in the front spaces of the gallery here at TAP. Works that Bidlo sent to Martin's grandmother, Greta, during World War II. For the Zoom viewers at home, Martin has prepared images to accompany his talk today, which we will share with you along the way, so you're going to have a chance to see the work as well, so stay tuned for the images to come. Okay, so in the Act 2, I'm going to come back to Martin for a conversation about this remarkable family history and why he decided to share it with us here at TAP during the Ting Festival. We'll have a chance to take your questions and cogitations, both here at TAP and from online, so keep that in mind as we go along. For the Zoomers, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll pick them up at the end as well. You can put them in at any point in time that you'd like. Martin Horak is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Western University, where he specializes in Canadian and comparative urban politics. He has an ongoing interest in 20th century European history, as you're going to hear today, with a particularly keen interest in the Czech Republic, where his family was from before fleeing from the Soviet invasion in 1968. He is also a musician who performs regularly with his wife, Amanda, who is here today. Yes, thank you for that, as part of the Heartaches. So please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Martin.
Hey, thanks, Josh. Is this up and running? Everybody can hear me? Okay, thank you so much for coming. 82 years ago, in the Central European city of Prague, an editorial cartoonist sent a love letter and some cartoons to my grandmother. For most of the 20th century, Prague was the capital of Czechoslovakia, but 82 years ago, it was the middle of World War II, and Prague was part of Nazi-occupied Bohemia and Moravia. It's called the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The cartoonist's name, as you've already heard, was František Bidlo. He'd been well known for his anti-fascist cartoons in the 1930s. This one's from 1934. But now, in World War II, he was hiding from the Nazis, staying with various friends and exchanging drawings for food. Bidlo didn't survive World War II. He was arrested by the Gestapo in January 1945, and he died after catching typhoid fever in the Terezín concentration camp. Not many people remember him today, not even in his native country. And actually, his native country no longer exists, since in 1993, Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So, how is it that we are here in downtown London, Ontario today, talking about a long-dead cartoonist from a faraway country that no longer exists? Well, my grandmother, whose name was Greta, kept those letters and drawings that she got in 1942. Here she is, as a young single woman on the left, around the time that Bidlo would have met her, and much later as a middle-aged married woman as well. The letters got passed on from her to Greta's daughter, my Aunt Micah, who I'll tell you about a bit later, and then to me when Micah died in 2022, and I brought them home to London. If you've had a chance to see them already, you'll know that they're quite remarkable, and we have 28 of them on display here and around the corner in the small space just out the door. They're graphically striking, they're funny, and they're also sometimes strange. And it's obvious that Bidlo was completely obsessed with Greta when he made them. When I brought them to London last year, my wife Amanda said, "You should go down to TAP and see if they like to display these as part of TingFest." So I did, and they did. And here we are. But aside from the work itself, there is a story attached to this work, one that I think is worth telling. In fact, there are two stories. One is the story of Bidlo and my grandmother Greta. It's a story of love in a time of war, of desire in the face of death. And the other story is a story of hope and connection that comes unexpectedly after loss. And this is my story. And I'd like to tell you both stories, and I'm going to start with my own, because that's what brought me eventually to Bidlo and Greta. So I grew up in Edmonton with my parents and my maternal grandparents. I was very close with my grandparents, who helped to raise me. I was the only child of Czech political refugees, and so from an early age, I learned about the ways in which our family's history and history with a capital H were connected. My grandfather, Jiří Krupička, was born in 1913 into a well-educated middle-class family in Prague. He became a geologist by profession, but in his heart, he was always a writer and a public intellectual. And these are some of the books that he published over the years. He was one of those men whose idealism, determination, and yes, also his ego, convinced him that they can nudge the course of history to the sheer force of their own will. And back in 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II, we're going to be moving back and forth through time here a little bit in this. So 3 years after the end of World War II, the Communist Party seized power in a coup in Czechoslovakia. The country effectively became a satellite of the Soviet Union. At this time, Jiří wrote a manuscript denouncing the nuclear arms race, and he tried to smuggle it across the border to Austria to get published. He got caught at the border, and he was sentenced to 16 years hard labor in Jáchymov, ironically mining uranium for the Soviet nuclear program. This had terrible consequences, as you might imagine, for his young family. My grandmother Ada was also imprisoned for a year, and my mom Helena and her sister Irina, who were little girls at the time, grew up without their dad. In the 1960s, reformist leaders came to power in Czechoslovakia, and most of the political prisoners who had survived the brutal conditions in the labor camps were released. This included my grandfather, Here he is at age 50, so basically my age, just after his release from the labor camps. In the late 60s, Czechoslovakia gradually opened up to the West, and for some time it looked like my mom's family might be able to live a more normal life after all. But in August 1968, the Soviet Union and its allies invaded Czechoslovakia to put an end to the political reforms, and my mom's family fled the country, eventually settling in Edmonton. My mom and dad were a couple by this time, and so my dad came to Canada with her. But his family didn't share the same political stories as my mom's, and they all stayed in Prague. As political refugees, my family in Edmonton kept a close emotional connection to their homeland. They raised me speaking Czech, and I think I absorbed Czech cultural values as much as Canadian ones. Maybe Amanda would say even more so. But I never heard much about my dad's family who were back in Prague. By the time I was a teenager, both of his parents had died. I knew that my dad had a half-sister named Micah, who was 9 years older than him, but they were estranged. They were estranged because Micah had married a communist, and my family kind of spat out the term like it was a poisonous mushroom. He was a communist. In 1989, when I was 17 years old, political change came to Central and Eastern Europe. Emboldened by reforms in Moscow and eventually by the fall of the Berlin Wall, in Germany, Czechs demonstrated in the hundreds of thousands demanding an end to the communist dictatorship. And just like that, it ended, virtually without violence. Suddenly I could go there, and I was eager to discover the home that I thought I had, but I'd never seen. And so in the 1990s, I spent a lot of time in Prague. I taught English, not very well, but I did. I worked as a journalist, and later I researched my doctoral thesis on urban politics in Prague. I grew to love the city, and it still feels like a second home to me. But I never connected with my Aunt Micah. Then 20 years ago, both my parents passed away, as did my beloved grandmother Ada, who had raised me. My grandfather Yuti, who you heard about, lived on to the age of 100, but quite suddenly, most of the people I had grown up with were gone within the span of a year. We buried my parents and my grandma in the family graves in Prague, and there they are. And with some trepidation, I found a contact for my Aunt Micah, who I'd never met, and I invited her to come to my dad's interment. I'm not sure who I expected, but I know it wasn't this slight old lady with sad eyes and a shy smile who showed up. For someone who had married a communist, she seemed surprisingly kind. In the years that followed, Micah and I gradually got to know each other. I took to staying with her when I'd visit Prague. Micah's husband and her only son had both passed away, and she lived alone in the same apartment that my dad's family had had for 70 years, the one that she and my dad had both called home when they were kids. Here's a view out the window, where the streetcars rumble by day and night. It was a well-kept place, filled with books. Micah told me that she loved the quiet, and she spent most of her days reading. When I came to visit, she and I would sit in the living room, and she would chain smoke and tell me stories about my dad's family. We grew close over those years. Micah had lived a hard life, but she wasn't bitter. She was open-minded and open-hearted. And we were survivors, both living with loss, and we found unexpected joy in each other's company. From Micah, I learned that my dad, Arnošt, was mostly raised by his grandmother, and there they are. And she spoke only German and no Czech. And that Micah, who was 9 years older than my dad, loved to take him out in his pram when he was a baby. And actually, in that picture on the left, that's the same window from which I took the picture of the trams 50 years later. I learned that on my dad's side of the family, too, people had chosen to stick their necks out rather than keep their heads down in the face of injustice. So let's go back in history again. In the late 1930s, Czechoslovakia was a democracy, but fascism was on the rise across Europe. My dad's father, my grandfather, Ferdinand Hauptgebauer, came from a German-speaking Czech family. At the time, about 20% of the country's population were German speakers, and most of them had very deep historical roots there. In the 1930s, Ferdinand worked in the international anti-fascist movement. He recruited young men to fight against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. When Hitler took over the Czech lands in March 1939 as a result of the Munich Accords, Ferdinand was sent to Buchenwald, which was the concentration camp for political prisoners. He survived there until 1944, when he was released and sent to a military hospital in Prague because he had tuberculosis. Among the things that Micah passed on to me, I have all the letters that Ferdinand wrote from Buchenwald to his mom. And if you want, after our talk, I have those letters here and a bunch of other artifacts that you'll see up in the slides if you want to check them out. My grandmother, who you've already seen, was Greta Erjavsová. She was born in Mohacs in southern Hungary in 1915. Her family fled from Hungary's right-wing dictatorship in the 1920s, and then as a young adult in the 1930s, Greta was active in the Czech anti-fascist movement as well. Her daughter Micah, my aunt, was born in 1937 when Greta was 22 years old and single. Around this time, Greta also got to know my grandfather Ferdinand, since they were both political activists, but they weren't a couple yet. In July 1939, just before the start of World War II, Greta was arrested in Vienna by the Gestapo, and this is her arrest warrant, which you can also see here on the table. She spent a year in a Nazi prison, and my 3-year-old Aunt Micah was sent to live with this elderly couple in a Czech village. I love the guy's pipe. She spent the rest of the war there, even after her mom was released and returned to Prague because her mom thought it was too dangerous for her to be in the city during the war. Now, somehow miraculously, Ferdinand and Greta both survived World War II. They'd lost touch with each other, but they were soon reunited through another twist of historical circumstance. At the end of the war, Ferdinand was released from hospital, but, as you may recall, he was an ethnic German. And so he was soon arrested by the occupying Soviet army and made to do forced labor repairing roads in Prague. As Micah loved to tell the story to me, one day in the fall of 1945, my grandmother Greta walked by Ferdinand's labor crew on a Prague street. She recognized Ferdinand from their time as activists before World War II. "Do you know who you have there?" she yelled at the guards. "He's an anti-fascist fighter. You have to let him go." And Greta managed to get Ferdinand released, and they fell in love. But there was another problem. There's always another problem. After World War II, the Czechoslovak government passed a decree expelling all 3 million German speakers, since most of them had supported Hitler. So Ferdinand and his mom faced expulsion unless they could prove that they had actively resisted the Nazis. Ferdinand's mom, my great-grandma, the one who raised my dad, the one who only spoke German, had helped Jewish people escape occupied Prague at the start of the war. And she had hidden Jewish people in her coal cellar as well during the war. And so she collected a set of letters from Jewish survivors attesting to what she did, and she was allowed to stay. And you can see one of those letters here as well. Ferdinand provided documentation about his work as a recruiter for the Spanish Civil War, but for good measure, he also changed the family name from Hauptgebauer, which is a German name, to Horak, which is a Czech name. And the government let him stay, and he and my grandmother got married. So I'm a proud Czech Canadian, but I only have a Czech name because my German grandfather didn't want to get expelled from Czechoslovakia. How's that for irony? So as Micah told me stories of my family, the pictures that František Bidlo had drawn for Greta were always in the background. There they are on her wall in the apartment. Micah had them up, and they clearly meant a lot to her. When we talked about what I might keep from her after she had died, which was a conversation we had a few times, she always insisted that most importantly, I should take the Bidlo pictures. But Micah didn't know too much about the circumstances in which they were created. She told me that Bidlo had met my grandmother in 1941 and that he fell madly in love with her. Micah said that the love was unrequited, but we don't really know, actually, if this was the case. After all, Greta kept this correspondence for the rest of her life, even after she'd married František. What we do know is that in January 1945, the Gestapo caught up with Bidlo and sent him to a concentration camp, and he died. So when I found out that Bidlo's work was going to be exhibited here at TAP, I decided to try to uncover more about the man's life. Online information is pretty limited. In fact, the longest article is something from Spartacus International, which is like the International Socialist website. So most of what I found out comes from this book, which was published in Czechoslovakia in 1959. The book is a product of the Stalinist era, so it's hardly neutral, and it sometimes verges on propaganda. The communists appropriated and celebrated Bidlo as kind of an early forerunner of what they were doing. But if you read between the lines, you can learn a lot about Bidlo's life and work. You'll find a written biography in Lab 203, where most of the work is, out and around the corner. So I'm just going to summarize briefly before we get to conversation. Bidlo was born into a working-class family in Prague in 1895. In this nondescript building, obviously this picture is not from 1895, but the building is still there. Magic of Google. So he was born into this working-class family, actually just a couple of blocks away from where my mom grew up half a century later. He really wanted to go to art school, and he was very talented at drawing, but his father thought this was a bourgeois and totally impractical idea. As we all know, art, totally impractical. So he sent him to apprentice as a hat maker. And as a young adult, Bidlo worked at the Jan Weiss hat factory. I couldn't believe that I actually found a picture of a Jan Weiss hat box. There you are. But he also fought for 3 years in the infantry in World War I, which, as you know, was just a giant massacre all around. And he was radicalized by this experience. And he joined the newly formed Czechoslovak Communist Party as soon as it was founded in 1921. During his early years as a graphic artist, Bidlo drew propaganda images like this for the Communist daily newspaper. At the time, Czechoslovakia was a multi-party democracy, and the Communist Party actually regularly got the largest amount of votes of any party. But there were many parties. The Communist Party was an anti-system party and wanted to topple the system, and so it never formed part of any of the coalition governments in the 20s and 30s. In 1929, the leadership of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia was taken over by people who were loyal to Stalin and the Soviet Union. And soon after that, Bidlo left the Communist Party, like many other radical artists and intellectuals of the time. There was this big exodus of the intelligentsia after the party became Stalinist. Bidlo became part of the avant-garde scene in 1930s Prague, and he developed an international reputation across Europe as a fearless editorial cartoonist. After the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, he became famous for poking fun at Hitler and calling out the brutality of the new regime long before many other people did. And here's a couple of examples of his work from this time. After World War II started and the Nazis occupied Prague, Bidlo went into hiding. It was during this time when his life was in danger and his status as an important cultural figure had collapsed that he met and fell in love with Greta. He was 46 at the time, and she was only 26. Was it a case of true love, or unrequited passion, or the creepy obsession of a man in desperate straits? We don't really know. But whatever the nature of the relationship, at a dark time in his life, Bidlo created a striking body of work that's alive with passion and humor and imagination. And there's an irony to that imagination because his own circumstances were so constrained. During our TingFest reception last week, when TingFest was opening, I talked with many people about the 28 pieces by Bidlo that we have here, and I saw their reactions, and it was clear to me that the work speaks to us beyond the time and place in which it was created. So, at this point in my own journey of unexpected connection and discovery, I'm sharing a bit of what I found. And as we move into our conversation, we'll form new threads of connection between the past and present and with each other. And I'm grateful for that opportunity. Thanks.
Amazing. Wow.
Hello.
Thank you, Martin, for sharing such a remarkable story. In fact, sharing two intertwining stories of hope and connection. in the aftermath of trauma and loss. The story of Bidlo and his relationship with your grandmother, Greta, during the upheavals of World War II, as well as the family history attached to these graphic artifacts down from your grandmother to your aunt and now to you. So I thought we could start off with a personal question for you, if you don't mind taking on a personal question.
It's all personal, right?
Yeah, it is very, very personal. What motivated you to tell this very personal story at the Ting Festival this year?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a couple of things. One is that it's another way that I can help to make sense right now of this really complicated story of my family's background and the way in which their personal stories intertwine with the big story of history. By sharing it, I get to put it out there and see what connects with people,
right,
what they're interested in, what kind of resonates, right? And so I guess, as I said a little bit at the end of the talk, there's this kind of, I want to make new connections as a result of what I've discovered, because otherwise it's kind of isolating, right? There's not a lot of people who are still alive in my family, very few, very, very few, actually. And there's this incredible big history. And I kind of feel like sometimes I carry that, and I want to put it out in the world, so I'm not carrying it. But also I feel like, in a different way, it's also about honoring that history, right? I mean, there's, that old cliche about, not forgetting history and being doomed to repeat it. We don't necessarily need to go there, but I do think that if we remember people's stories and share people's stories, then we honor their memory. And I do want to honor the memory of my family. So there's also that. And I guess finally, I really just do think that these are neat pieces, and that people will be interested in seeing them. And so far, that's kind of been borne out. People have been pretty excited to see this stuff.
Amazing. Martin and I had a chance to chat about the pieces that you just mentioned that are out here at the front and then into the gallery over here. I hope everybody had a chance to see them. If not, make sure you do. And you said something that struck me at the time. You remarked that you learned a tremendous amount about the stories that you didn't know before the process of curating the material for TingFest. And near the end of the talk today, you described this process as a journey of unexpected connection and discovery.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could get you to reflect on what this journey of discovery has been like over the past few months of curating this. What were some of the things that you learned that you might not have known had you not done this exhibition?
Yeah, thanks for the question. By the way, we didn't prep these questions in advance, so...
no, he has no idea what I'm asking.
But it makes sense to ask that question, and I think it's a really interesting one. So, as you might have gathered from my talk, I mean, there's this whole story about my own discovery of a different part of my family, my dad's family, right, which I hadn't known about until the last few years. And so there's that kind of longer process of discovery that happened, because I grew up with a certain narrative about who we are and where we come from. And I got a different perspective, right? But as soon as I realized that this is something that's going to be kind of out here in the world through the medium of this exhibition, I felt like I needed to find out a little bit more about who Bidlo was. And so in doing that, I think part of what happened is that I understood in a different way the way in which this work, which was always something that was like super personal, and it was up on my aunt's wall. It was like, yeah, this guy who was in love with your grandmother. Isn't it cool, this work? It's interesting. I learned about his place, right? His place in kind of the historical development of Czechoslovakia and the 1920s and 30s. And I learned that, this guy was also kind of a significant figure in his own right. And so it's this kind of another layer or thread of connection between, the personal and the political. And for me, a lot of the kind of theme of understanding my family's history is understanding how the personal and the political, how the big things and the little things are connected and how they shape people's lives in unexpected ways. And so it kind of added another layer to that for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it sounds like Micah gave you not only the gift of the works themselves, but she gave you the gift of your story, the gift of the narrative that you were missing. Was she eager to tell you that story? Did you have to pull it out over time? What was that dynamic like?
No. She was, okay, so that's a really great question. So the dynamic actually changed a little over time. We first met at my dad's interment, as I said, which was 19 years ago, maybe? 20 years ago. And she seemed great, and then I didn't connect with her for a while again. I was kind of sitting on the fence about it. Then I connected, and we started spending time together. And I think that after a couple of visits, once she decided that I wasn't a jerk, and once I decided that she wasn't some terrible, wife of a communist who I should hate, then we really opened up to each other. And she was really eager to tell these stories because she had no one else to tell them to. Right. Her husband had died, her only son had died. She had no relatives. She was completely on her own, except for some friends of her late sons who would help to take care of her. But she wanted to share these stories. I was her only surviving family member. And so once that opened up, boy, did I hear a lot. At one point, about 4 or 5 years ago, I realized that I'd been visiting with her. I'd heard all these stories, and they're going kind of in and out of my memory, right? And so I said, Michael, we have to get on the phone, and I'm going to interview you, right? And we're going to get all these stories again.
Wow.
So I have about a 3.5-hour tape at home of an interview that I did from my office a few years ago, getting her to tell me all of this stuff, one thing after another, because I thought, I don't want to lose this, right? But she was very eager to tell the story because for her, it also helped her to make sense of her life, I think, and of where she was. And just one more thing about her, one of the things that I think was remarkable about her, and Amanda, who got to know her a bit too, might also kind of attest to this, is that, so she'd had a very, very hard life, and she spent basically all of that life taking care of other people, as many women did in hard times, because that's such a gendered thing, right? And so she just spent all her life taking care of other people. And she was now on her own, and she actually, in some ways, I think really liked being on her own, but she needed to kind of find out what it all meant for her. And I think her telling me these stories was kind of part of that. And I think it helped her to come to a different kind of peace with where her life had ended up as well.
Right, absolutely.
What language?
In Czech. In Czech, yes.
Lucky that you were brought up in a little Czech boy.
Yeah. So I speak Czech fluently still. And she only speaks Czech. So if we didn't have, if my parents, my kind of very anti-communist exile had been kicked out of the country, basically parents didn't raise me in Czech, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to connect to this other person who came from a very different storyline, right?
Yeah. So Bidlo, do you remember your first time seeing? Was it over time that you gradually noticed these works, or was there one definitive moment that you can recollect that you saw these works and you recognized?
I think the very first time that we went over to her apartment, and I can't remember, Amanda, if it was with you or on my own, right? Oh, right, yeah, because she was kind of shy about that as well, right? And we were like, okay, look, one person's enough, right? The very first time I went over, those 10 that are up by the front door, they're just behind the bar, were up in a sort of like arch in her living room.
Wow.
Right? And so you walk in and there they were. So I saw them the very first time, and I remember asking her, I was like, well, these are really neat. What are these? Where'd you get these?
Yeah.
And so she told me just a little bit about the story. But then I didn't kind of find out more until gradually. Right. And the larger set, which is in the other room here, was in her bedroom.
Oh, wow.
So,
the catalog of loves.
Yeah, the catalog of loves. Yeah, I love that one.
And that was, wow, okay. That's an interesting thing. So right at the outset of your talk, you mentioned that Bidlo's work is not very well known, not even in the Czech Republic or Slovakia. Why do you think Bidlo, who was a prominent cultural figure during his life, has become so obscured from cultural memory? And I find this interesting because given the heroism of his early resistance to Nazism and to fascism, you would think he would be a celebrated hero.
Yeah, you'd think, huh? Yeah, it is interesting. So, I mean, I don't have a definitive answer, but I have some theories.
Good, that's we'll take the
So, I mean, one theory is that I think that sometimes cartoonists are not taken as seriously as other kinds of artists, which I think is really unfortunate because he apparently had a huge influence.
Right.
But I think that's a little bit of it. But I think that the bigger reason probably is that, as is obvious, he was a guy who was on the radical left, right? He started out as a communist, then he dropped out of the Communist Party, but even after he dropped out of the Communist Party, he was very much an anti-fascist kind of guy. And, for us in the West, and I mean, certainly even in Europe, that story of resistance against fascism is very much seen as something that needs to be heard, seen, and celebrated.
Yeah.
But in the Czech Republic in particular, is the fact that he was so connected with the Communist Party, which then in 1948 staged a coup and spent 40 years oppressing people, means that people are not that interested, right? It's not just Bidlo, it's a lot of people who are kind of those anti-fascist fighters, people on the left in the 20s and 30s. Even if the Czech Republic and the Czech culture celebrates them, it doesn't necessarily celebrate their political activity.
Yeah.
It might celebrate, other things that they do. For example, a lot of the really famous surrealist painters of 1920s and 30s, Czechoslovakia produced this great surrealist scene. A lot of those guys were communists as well. Nobody really talks that much about that because there's still this collective trauma in Czechoslovakia or in the Czech Republic from 40 years of dictatorship. And so people, by association with that, even if their communist activity was at a time when it was not a dictatorship, but when it was kind of the underdogs fighting against oppression, if they're associated with that, they're kind of delegitimized. And you understand where that comes from, right? I think it makes sense from a historical perspective. It wasn't even until the last maybe 10 years or so that the history of the communist period in Czechoslovakia is taught in Czech schools. For a while, they were just like, we don't want to go there.
Right.
Right. So, which makes sense.
Yeah,
so,
does make sense. Yeah, and it's interesting because Bidlo was self-taught.
Yes.
He didn't go to art school, and yet had a very significant, as you mentioned earlier, had a significant impact. And I wonder if I could get your opinion on what is it that made him such a distinctive caricaturist or cartoonist? Do you have any thoughts and theories on what made him so distinctive?
My theories here are on even thinner ice than the previous theories, mainly because I am certainly, I'm not a graphic arts historian. I'm very far away from that. So, although I do love art history, but anyways, a couple of very tentative thoughts.
Yeah.
One is that he was kind of in the right place at the right time to some extent because he found himself in the middle of this kind of really vibrant avant-garde modernist cultural scene, right? And so he was actually friends with a lot of people who are now much more famous than he ever was or that certainly is now. So like one of his best friends was Jaroslav Seifert, who much later on got the Nobel Prize for Literature, who was a very famous poet, and other people who were kind of like really at the core of the Czech cultural scene. So he was in that circle. And I think those folks supported him. In fact, from the book, if we're going to believe the book, and I think I generally believe the facts, I just don't believe the tone, right? But apparently those folks really supported him by getting, for example, arranging for exhibitions for him in Paris and stuff like this, right? So he was in the cultural scene. But the other thing is that I think from that kind of position of power in a way in this cultural scene, he was also very fearless. Right, and so my understanding is that he did things like drew, cartoons of Hitler looking like a complete idiot at a time when everybody was really scared of Hitler. Right, and so I think really pushing that envelope is part of what got him well known as well. And there's this kind of there's this kind of undercurrent. It's not even an undercurrent. It's very much a current in Czech culture, from my perspective, is kicking against authority, subverting authority, pushing against it. There's good historical reasons for that. It's a small country surrounded by big countries, and so shit happens, right? And a lot of kind of Czech cultural creativity and energy comes out of that sort of subversive energy of trying to push against those in power. And he was very much in that, right? And so in the Czech Republic or in Czechoslovakia, he fit in with a cultural trope or a way of understanding what is important to us as a nation, which is we are a nation of people who, laugh in the face of authority.
Wow. I'm going to come back to this because I really like that. Well, I think that was a pirouette over thin ice, if I do say myself. That was a very, I love this note that Hofmeisterstedt was a contemporary and Fred magic game of loop and line to describe his work. But Jaroslav Seifert, who you just mentioned, in an introduction to one of Bidlo's exhibitions, he remarked, and this is a quote from the eventual Nobel Prize winning colleague, compatriot, comrade, I suppose. I believe the path of the satirist to be the hardest of all. This man wishes to love, but deals instead vengeance and punishment. His line is a keen swish that cracks like a whip, governed half by hate and half by true love. And that's Yaroslav.
That's great. I haven't heard that quote.
Bidlo's satirical work in criticism of Hitler and fascism certainly brings that keen swish of the whip. But his works to Greta give us a view of the true love. And yet, I don't think those works were seen by. And is this the first time?
Oh yeah, those works have not been seen by anybody except for people in my immediate family until now.
Right.
So yeah.
But that true love element, and these are composed in the midst of World War II, one of the darkest periods.
Yeah. Well, I guess, once you can't kick against authority because you're going to die, what's left but love, right? So, there it is. I think, it's interesting, right? They really haven't been seen because as far as I'm aware, they, were in a drawer for decades. And then after everybody else in her family died, my Aunt Micah, this was about 20 years ago, around the time that I got to know her, asked a friend of hers to get them framed, and she put them up in her apartment. But I'm, going back to Bidlo and love, I think, this is the question. We really don't know. I said this towards the end of the presentation, and we really don't know whether this was love, really, or some kind of fantasy of love at the very obsession, or some kind of fantasy of something by somebody who was really at the very end of his rope, right? So, because he must have been, right? He knew that it was probably only a matter of time, although apparently he managed to hide for like 3.5 years or something, but I'm pretty sure he felt like it was only a matter of time until the Gestapo caught up with him, and that was that, right? Because obviously, given the picture you saw of Hitler, right? Things were not good. They were not looking good for him. So this kind of outpouring of this, and if you look at the pictures, you'll see, they're so fantastical. They're all about, if I were a seafarer and a bullfighter, and they're, they're this kind of, there's these images, these flights of fancy, and these images of freedom and boundlessness from some guy who was stuck in a coal cellar, probably. Yeah. Right? So is that about love, or is it about escape, or is it about what? Probably some of all of those things, right?
Yeah, brilliant. I want to return to something that you said earlier, and this is through, and I dug up this quotation also from Adolf Hofmeister, who is also a contemporary cartoonist and friend of Bidlo, and he remarked, "Laughter and endurance in the face of evil, such are the two main elements of national Czech and Slovak character." I thought that was a really interesting way. Now, you can certainly see laughter and endurance in Bidlo's works on display here, created in that dark period of occupation from 1939 to 1945. When you first showed me these works, you said they highlight a unique form of Czech irony. And I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about Czech irony.
Yes, a little bit. And we have other people who are Czech in the audience as well, and maybe they can tell you more too. But no, okay, I think this is a good question, right? It's connected to what I was saying before about laughing in the face of authority, right? I think that one kind of very important mode of expression and kind of almost like empowerment in Czech culture is to produce work that is somehow ironic, that kind of twists what you might expect, and especially inverts relationships of power and authority. It's very important. So a few of you might have heard of this book from 100 years ago called The Good Soldier Švejk, which is a very famous Czech book at the time. And it was a satirical novel written by an author who had been through the trenches of World War I, just after World War I. And The Good Soldier Švejk is this kind of dumb, bumbling soldier who inadvertently keeps undermining authority during his experience as a soldier in the war, right? And so, for example, he thinks he's going to be a spy, and he dresses up as a Russian soldier, and then he gets captured by his own unit and treated as a POW. So there's a long history in Czech culture of both kind of ironic and absurdist art,
right.
Which really kind of aims, I think, to subvert authority by standing the kind of normal relationships and consequences on their heads, or on their head. And I think, again, it comes from Czechs understanding of themselves as Ladislav Holý, this anthropologist, wrote a book called The Little Czech and the Great Czech Nation, and which is a great title. And people, I think many Czechs understand themselves, and I won't speak for Slovaks so much because I don't know so much about Slovak culture, but a lot of Czechs understand themselves kind of culturally to be a nation that is great but is constrained always and
right.
screwed over and disempowered by the powerful in all their guises, whether they be from different nations or in fact from their own, right? And so it's the connection to that kind of brings out this irony, this kind of ironic core to Czech culture and Czech cultural expression.
Right, and I've only got a few more questions here, and I'm going to bring all of you in. So get questions and cogitations ready for Martin, and we can bring you into the conversation here. In that same essay by Hofmeister that I mentioned before, he says Czechoslovak literature has always embodied leitmotifs of revolt and obstinacy, sharpened in the history of the country from its beginnings, which is it's exactly what you just...
It's a better way of saying what I just said.
Complete agreement. You noted that on your dad's side of your family, folks had a tendency, and this is to quote you, to stick their necks out rather than keep their heads down in the face of injustice. So perhaps this is something of a family trait as much as it is a national characteristic that Greta shared with Bidlo. Would that be a fair observation, or would...
Well, I think it might be a fair observation. I mean, certainly if you look kind of, statistically at the number of people in my family a couple of generations back who did things that were awfully risky and had terrible consequences for themselves, and sometimes in the case of my maternal grandfather, really for their whole family, right? Clearly there was this kind of tendency, whether we want to find it admirable or reckless, I don't know, but to kind of stick one's neck out, right?
Yep.
It's funny, and I sometimes wonder if I had the misfortune of living in a situation that was kind of politically as fraught as those situations, whether I would stick my neck out, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't know how much that's inherited and how much that comes as a result of kind of the circumstances you're raised in, but either way, I think, they were people of principle. Yeah. Right?
What do you think? Well, in terms of, what's your reflection on that history of your family? Is it something that inspires admiration? But it's also created fracture where you're reconstructing family story too.
Well, I have way more thoughts than I can put into good words, honestly.
Get you on the couch here.
Yeah, that's right.
Freud had some time in Prague as well.
Yeah. So your question, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, and I just in terms of how you reflect on that family history, what the impact of this...
is for me?
Yeah.
For me, right. It is inspiring and intimidating and sometimes frustrating and maddening. Right. It's a lot of different things because, ultimately, to be perfectly honest, being the only child of all these people who had kind of left, right? Actually, it's not entirely true. I have a first cousin who spent some time living in Edmonton with his mom as well. But for a lot of the time, it was me growing up with my parents, my grandparents. And, like many second-generation kids, and, maybe some of you are second generation or, know people who are... My parents had left from these very difficult circumstances, and they presented all this history to me as something like, look at all this stuff that happened. You have all these opportunities. Go do us proud, right? Go make something of yourself. go and be a force for good in this world. And that's an intimidating place to be. And at the same time, it's very much something that, it's just like what I grew up with, right? And so, I mean, this is another reason why I'm really, really excited to put this stuff out there.
Yeah.
Because, as I said, then it's not just about me and, what does it mean for me? But I'm asking other people, what does it mean for you? How do you understand this? And it helps me to feel like I'm not somehow like some weird fulcrum of history or something like that, right? Which could either make me into some megalomaniac or completely crush me, right? I don't want to be either of those things.
Yeah.
So,
well, let's take that question, not rhetorically, but actually ask everybody. What was your impression of the works when you saw them? And we've got a microphone. I got our tech people on surprise there. We've got a mic, otherwise people at home can't hear you. Just over here. Right here.
The question you had before was whether or not this was an expression of unrequited love or obsession or whatever. There's possibly another way to look at it too. He was living in an extremely volatile, chaotic, frightening time. These cartoons were perhaps just a way of putting all that aside and finding a way to rise above all of the stuff around him. So your grandmother may have been sort of the lucky catalyst for this kind of feeling.
Lucky or perhaps unlucky, but yes. I'd be so curious to know, but we are never going to know because there's nobody left to ask whether, they had anything of a personal relationship. I don't know. I mean, they had met. At least my Aunt Micah says they met. But whether they spent time together, whether they actually were romantically involved, goodness knows. But I think you're absolutely right, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's part of, you can see that in the kind of, the playfulness and the kind of escapist nature of some of these drawings, right? That he's rising above or escaping from or moving out of. I mean, I don't know exactly where he stayed, but, apparently with various friends, moving from house to house, not going outside ever, doing drawings for people so that they would give him food. So that was a pretty shitty existence. So yeah.
Other thoughts? Anybody? Yeah, up here, right here. Jamelia up front. Oh, right over your corner.
Thank you so much. Very fascinating. And I'm wondering if your grandmother, Greta, kept a journal, or did she ever correspond back, like on the other side? Or have you been at all tempted to kind of like write the narrative from her point of view?
Right.
That's one comment, question. The other is like, what happens to the collection? Like, do you have thoughts about where the collection might reside eventually at some point in the future as a phenomenal kind of narrative, and from your own subjective relationship to it, and the actual documents and all of it together represents a fantastic collection of materials. So have you thought about like where it might go in the future?
Okay.
It's a great question.
Both good questions. Okay, for the first one, I don't know that she ever wrote a diary or anything like that. If she did, I'm not going to find it anymore because my Aunt Micah died about a year and a half ago, and we had agreed that I would go to Prague and sort through all the stuff in her apartment. So I went in February last year, and I brought this back, sent several big boxes of old family documents, all kinds of amazing stuff. Don't even get me started. A couple of things are on the table there, but I have boxes and boxes of things like, family land deeds from 200 years ago, and I mean, you name it, but there's nothing in there. I went up and down through the apartment. There's nothing in there about this. So if she wrote something, it's gone somewhere. I don't know that I would want to try to imagine it from her side. I mean, it's a cool thing for like a creative writer to probably do or something like that, but that's not really me. So maybe somebody else might want want to do that. But it's hard to know. It's hard to imagine. But it would be interesting. I mean, I do know some other things about her life, more than I said here. I know a fair bit. And so from that, you could kind of construct a plausible narrative from the other side, but we have nothing direct. In terms of what to do with this stuff, well, that's something I'm thinking about. I think it's a bit of a longer term project to think about because, as I just mentioned, I have a lot of things and they're connected. And this is its own thing in a way. I think this is a kind of cultural value that some of the other pieces that I have don't. Some of it is much more personal, only personal. But I feel like I need some time to kind of process and think through whether to treat all of these things that I have inherited and I've chosen to keep in my life as something, as kind of a body, as an archival body that goes together, if so, where it goes. So these are kind of questions that I'll eventually work out answers to. For the moment, when they aren't at tap, the 10 If I Were pieces are up in my office at Western, because I think it's a nice conversation starter and they're fun to have up there. The others have just been in a box for now, so we'll figure it out. I would like them to be publicly seen again, and if people are interested. So if, at the end of this exhibition in a few weeks, I've got a lot of feedback about, like, these are really neat pieces. We already have now texts that I've written up and stuff, and we kind of have a package, and it would be nice to see whether somewhere else they could be exhibited. Maybe a little book. I mean, down the road, one thing that I would like to contemplate doing is to write a book about the bigger story that I was telling here, right? That's not just about Bidlo, but that, that kind of weaves together this story of the personal and the political in 20th century Central Europe, because I think it's a really interesting story. So that could be a book that I might imagine myself probably not writing until I'm retired from Western, though, because it takes a while, right? So, yeah. So a lot of thought processes about these things. I would love to see this exhibition go somewhere else, though, if there's interest. So that's something I'm going to be thinking about.
That's great. Oh, we have two questions. Greg's got the microphone here. We've got a question in white shirt up here, and then back over here. Thanks, Greg.
Just hold it in front of you.
Yep, just hold it. That's perfect.
Very much for exposing all of this. I'm very much afraid that this is the norm for a lot of people in the world right now, of trying to hold on to the civility. And thank God you are exposing this wonderful trail of civility that has lasted through two countries and through 3 or 4 generations. Please do something more with it. We all need to be aware of how you can keep your civility in these times.
Yeah, I know. I mean, one of the ways in which, one of my reactions sometimes when I read the news from places like Ukraine or Israel and Palestine or other places where terrible violent things are going on right now is, I think of this sometimes, right? There's connections, there's resonances, right? And there are an awful lot of people who are faced with circumstances that in some ways are not that different right now. And I mean, it's horrible to think about, but yes, I mean, I think there is a story about civility and dignity in this, but it's also not easy, right? I mean, every time somebody in my family chose to really stand up for something, there were consequences, and they were like very severe, right? And not everybody has got either that, gumption or that, in some way, almost recklessness to be able to do that, right? So, in a way, I'm particularly interested in, and I want to dig a little bit more into the story of my grandmother Greta, who was this anti-fascist activist and so on, because this kind of standing up to authority in terrible circumstances was in mid-20th century Europe. It was a very male preserve, right? Because men, after all, even disempowered men had more power than women. And to see, some of the women that were kind of putting themselves in these positions is a particularly interesting story to me, because the risks were even higher. So it's not really an answer to a question, I guess, but thank you for your comments.
No, it's not a question. I was just affirming what you're doing.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bravery of your people.
No.
And of course there would be no journals. That's fascism. They were all
Yeah, no, there's no journals at all in my family. Until my mom kept some journals after they came to Canada.
Yeah, and Micah has a quiet kind of strength and leadership by keeping that memory and giving you the story too.
Yeah.
It's a journal.
Yeah.
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, she didn't write anything
She's
down, but at least I got the stories,
personified
right?
history. Yeah.
And I will say about her as well in her stories that I'm very confident in her stories. And by that I mean that, not that her memory was flawless, but, and you know, I'm hardly objective, but I feel like she was the kind of person who didn't really have an agenda at her point in her life. Everybody had died, you know, she just connected to me and she just wanted to say what had happened as she understood it, right? And so I actually take her word pretty much at face value, insofar as kind of her memory can contain it. That she wasn't spinning something to like make herself look good or make somebody else look bad. It was just what it was. So, and that's very valuable.
Right. We have a question over here.
So first of all, thank you for putting this together and sharing the story, and really kudos to you for taking action on a family story that's really at the edge of disappearing. 2-3 generations out. I know personally we have stories, a lot of stuff from the war, and our family was in Holland, and fascinating stories about interactions with the Nazis and the resistance and such. But now that generation who actually experienced it is gone, and all you have are sort of the echoes and the game of telephone between, you know, my mom to me to when I tell the story.
Right, yeah.
So
Yeah.
really, like,
That's why I got the recording. I was like, I can't remember this.
Like, well, the
Yeah.
source is still alive. You took action and you caught that. Now you're sharing that with us here today. So very much appreciated.
Thanks.
The question I have is, so how many letters are there between your grandmother and Bidlo, the artist? How many did he send?
There is one letter, which you'll see over there. It's an illustrated letter, 5 pages with 1 page missing. And the text is just crazy and ridiculous, you'll see. Anyway, you just have to read it to believe it. It's really weird and fun letter.
Okay,
There's one letter, and there are these 2 sets of illustrations, a set of 10 and a set of 13. That's it.
Yeah, and there is translation of the text. Yeah.
The translations of the text are there, yeah.
And so when were they sent? Like all together in one?
No, there's 3 dates. So I believe the If I Were pictures that are on the wall right there came first in January 1942, and then a letter, I think the letter followed in early February, and the series of 13 followed in mid-February. So it's like, we're talking like a 4-week period, 3 pieces of correspondence, that's it.
So I guess
It's a very point-in-time situation.
where I'm really like, curious and trying to figure out is, you mentioned what sort of a love affair was this? Was this just a fantasy, unrequited thing? So that's why I was like, how long did these letters go on? How often, you know, was the chance that she wasn't writing back to him and he was
Okay, so we do know, or we can at least infer that she probably did write back to him, unless he was completely unhinged, because the letter starts with no, actually, it's the introductory letter for the series of 13 starts with, thank you very much for your kind reply to my letter. So unless he's totally imagining things, she wrote him.
Yeah.
But, you know, he would have ended up with that, and goodness knows where that went. We don't have it. But yeah, whether this is a tip of an iceberg of correspondence or like this is it, we have no idea.
And do you have any theories on the missing
page?
The missing page?
Yeah, my theory is either she liked it too much and didn't want to, you know, just
No
kept
one
it
else
really
could see it.
close, didn't want anybody else to see it.
Yeah.
Or she hated it and threw it out. Or third theory is that it was too explicit. Because we do know that Bidlo actually drew like erotic cartoons
Erotic
as well.
Russian fairy tales. He did the illustration for erotic Russian fairy tales.
You know, so who knows what was on that page? We will not know.
Yeah. We've got a question over here. We got 2.
Where?
Gonna come up. in the front. It's for everybody at home so they can hear the questions. Otherwise, everybody sounds like Charlie Brown's parents.
I feel like I shouldn't talk, but I can't help myself. I am Martin's wife, and I did know Micah, and I got to witness what was a truly, I would almost say, magical growth from her being really afraid of Martin because she had this bad relationship with his family, and her showing up at the memorial shaking and chain smoking as like a 72-year-old frail lady, to them being extremely close and watching them say goodbye for the last time and cry. And she would send me gifts every time he went. But I just wanted to tell you one thing about Micah that to give you a sense of her own personal strength. She was a pensioner, and if you know Eastern European pensioners, it means that they're just really, really poor. They don't have anybody. They're surviving on like a third of what old age pension would be here in Canada, something like that. And she insisted on feeding us even when we tried to take her out for dinner or something. She smoked several packs a day until the end of her life, so everything we have from her house smells like cigarette smoke. And she, despite her husband being a Communist Party member, which meant a lot of things, hid political things against the government, against the communist government in their house. But the thing most of all that I wanted to tell you is that 4 years ago, I think it was, she was mugged and had her femur broken.
Ooh.
And she didn't even tell Martin for like a couple of weeks. And she was hospitalized, she survived, she recovered. She was fine in the end. She had a bowel blockage that she died from. But this woman was exactly like you said, Josh, a quiet strength and a quiet voice. And in terms of agency, which is what you guys are talking about with Greta, you can see how she inherited a certain kind of female agency that inspires me. And that my husband, who lost his entire family, suddenly had a new family member was a big deal. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah.
Thanks, hon. Yeah.
Thank you for
Oh, I say something about that. No, I forgot.
Brian can talk.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just curious, you mentioned that Bidlo produced a number of other painting, you're assuming, or drawings during the Second World War to
Right.
for people to feed them or
Yes.
offer hospitality or in some way. I'm just curious if you've been able to locate any of those other drawings that he might have done from other people, just to, I mean, it might obviously part of a much larger project, but to put the images and letters that he sent to your mother or to your grandmother in context. I'm just wondering if you know of or have seen other things.
Yes, I have. Yeah, so the vast majority of what I've seen is in that book, and you can go look at it. The Big Green Book, it has, I think, it says 1,200 illustrations of his work. So that's basically in the late 50s when the communist government decided to turn him into this kind of icon, you know, another of our martyrs sort of a thing, right? So they went all out, they produced this book, and they scoured around for all of the stuff they could find. They didn't find this stuff. Because it was somewhere in a drawer and they weren't getting it, right? But they got all its political cartoons, and it's also part of what is included in that book is kind of memoirs of my friendship with Bidlo from various other famous artists, right? And they contributed the drawings that he'd done of them and their family and stuff and caricatures to the book. So there's stuff in there, right? Conspicuously absent is anything erotic. The communists were kind of prudish. They weren't going to put that in the book, especially if he was going to be like a working class hero. But because we know that sort of stuff exists. And there is nothing like this. There's like caricatures of his friends, but there's no other, like, I've flipped through the book pretty thoroughly. I haven't found any other, like, material expressing his love for somebody or something like that, or romantic stuff. In fact, a lot of it is really harsh. Like, a lot of his political cartooning style was very, not just laugh in the face of authority, but like really middle finger in the face of authority. It's a very kind of harsh humor. It's quite a violent humor sometimes. So there's a lot of that. So in other words, yes, we have lots of stuff to contextualize it, but but this is, it seems really unique. I have not found, it's not like I've spent months scouring the internet or something. I haven't done a real research project, but I haven't found anything that looks really anything like this.
May I ask another question, completely unrelated? Did you have any difficulties exporting cultural property across borders?
I worried about that.
It's a very particular question.
But I didn't have difficulties. I mean, my strategy was going to be to, pull out Micah's will that says that her stuff goes to me.
Right.
She had two things. She had all her stuff and she had her apartment, which she owned. And she gave her apartment to the friends that had taken care of her for the last 15 years of her life, who was actually her son's best friend and his family, which, I think was the right thing to do. But she said, you should come and have anything you want from my apartment. So I went. And so anyway, so I had her will, right? But nobody ever asked me anything when I was packing boxes or anything like that. And it's also like, if this had something that, these pictures had, if we were able to kind of really know, like, I don't know, what am I trying to say? If these were pictures by somebody who was like a famous Czech painter, right? I couldn't have got away with just putting him in a Czech post in bubble wrap and sending him to myself, which is what I did. I would have, had to declare value and so on. But with his work, although his original work is very rare right now, and so it does fetch some auction prices, because so much of it, the political work, the originals were all destroyed by the Nazis, and so that book is all based on like old newspaper archive reproductions and stuff, right? So there is some value to the work, but it's so hard to say what the value might be. Anyway, the short answer to the question is, I was worried about it, but no, there weren't any particular issues. Yes.
What I find so fascinating about this is the provenance that you've been able to establish here, the authenticity that you've been able to establish across the drawings, across the documents, which are, from what I can see, very, very extensive. And then you've got the recording.
Yeah.
You've got the recording. And then you have other recollections from your family members who have verified to you.
And I got a long recording from of my grandfather as well, from just a few years before he died, also talking about stuff. And, yeah.
It's like from an archives and heritage point of view. I mean, you've got very phenomenal sort of standard provenance here, and not to put pressure on you, I think you have other research.
Jamili's point of write a book.
I'm not concerned, but I'm really interested in understanding where this goes in terms of what the permanent home.
Yeah, well, it is something that I'm going to put thought into, Sam, and yeah, it's a very good question. I do actually worry in the about already what has been done. I mean, I guess I can't worry about that, but last year I had 6 days in Prague, and I spent basically like 12 to 14-hour days in the apartment for 6 days going through stuff. I really kind of wasn't able to go through everything carefully, right? I might have left stuff behind that was valuable, but whatever. I mean, hey, what is done is done. I did my best. But I'm going to continue to do my best and sort of think about, where does this go? I think, because it's so much a personal story as well, I feel like I have to kind of sit with it and work with it and make something of it myself. But, maybe it eventually goes back. Like, I can imagine a lot of this stuff eventually traveling back to the Czech Republic, and going into the National Archives there or something like that. The National Archives has Bidlo stuff. And, in terms of long-term repository for the Bidlo stuff, I wouldn't mind seeing it back there at some point as well, potentially, right? Or it could stay with my family, I don't know. But, they're difficult questions.
That's 2 votes for a book, just for the record, in terms of the interest in and your maternal grandfather wrote all the way into, because he lived to over 100 years old, and one
Yeah.
of his books, I think, was a bestseller in the Czech Republic and was recommended by the Prime
By
Minister.
Václav Havel. Yeah, actually, it was his book of the year in 1994,
There
my
you go.
grandfather's
So
book.
This is a long history here of that you can follow of writing books.
Yeah. Although I don't know how much, it was more like, some people really loved it rather than it was a bestseller, because he didn't write easy books. He wrote these books of like social theory, and it's a very interesting kind of conservative brand of social theory. If anybody's read Harold Bloom, sometimes when I was reading a closing of The American Mind, it made me think of my grandfather's books, but they're all in Czech.
Oh, Alan Bloom, yeah.
Not Harold Bloom, Alan Bloom,
yeah.
excuse me.
Yeah.
The problem of what you do with these things is part of a huge problem that probably everybody in this room has. I've got in my basement sets of sketchbooks by two different artists. All of these are sort of common, ordinary objects that really reveal a huge amount about our culture and our history, but for which there is no repository, realistically.
Sure.
We can send them in a box to the National Archives, but they're going to die there if they accept them. And that's increasingly what's happening with museums, that there's really no place for them to go, but they really represent the truest way of looking at our history. So I think it's a part of a much, much bigger question that we have to solve.
You know what? That did give me a thought, actually, and I really appreciate this conversation because this helps me figure this out. Sort of connecting what you said to what Sam said, I think in a way for me, when I really think about it, it's not quite as important to answer the question of where this stuff is going to sit as what is going to be done with it, right? Because there are millions and millions and millions of pages of amazing archival material that are sitting moldering in people's basements and in national archives and stuff. Nobody ever sees them. Nobody ever does anything with them, right? And so I've got this fairly coherent collection of stuff. So I think if and when I kind of figure out how to do this, the thing to do is going to be for me to try to weave this together into a story that I can tell through a book or through something like that. And then the stuff will go where the stuff will go, right? But it's kind of like, do something with it. And that's, I guess, part of why I'm doing this, right?
Well, it's got to remain active, which is what you're doing. Otherwise, it just dies in a box.
Exactly.
Right. And maybe one more question. Do we have anything online, Greg? No? Okay. Well, we'll end. This will be our
This isn't a question. I just want to speak up for as a librarian, and I just want to say that it is a major concern of librarians and archivists to make sure that the collections that we collect are also used. So it's and I completely respect.
I did not mean to cast aspersions.
No, not at all. But I just want to emphasize that they're not just moldering in place. We do try to create, good conditions for them, and try to exploit them in the best way so that people can discover them.
Fund libraries and archives.
Yes.
Exactly, yes.
There we go. And
so, go ahead.
Yep, no.
No, I was just going to say, since we are about to wrap up here, that if you don't need to leave right away and get on with your day, I'm going to go over to the table with like the little artifacts and stuff, and feel free to visit and see what there is there. And then, of course, there's all of Bidlo's stuff here and around the corner in the little room if you haven't had a chance to see it yet.
I was just going to say the exact thing that you just said, which is perfect.
Yeah.
But I was going to add to that that I wanted to thank everybody who joined us today. This is a tremendous audience as part of the first ever Canadian Art Hop is actually happening today, and this is one of the spots. There's 6 galleries in London that are participating. This is, as Sandra said, the first event, not the first conversation talk. There was an event yesterday, but there are many more to come in the Ting lineup. So look at the website, and I think there is a program of events here too that you should pick up a program. I'll see you at some of those upcoming events as well. So thank you all so much for coming out today to join us. Thank you to Martin for a brilliant talk. And thanks everybody online for joining us. Thank you. Stick around and come chat with Martin.